1968 was one of the most turbulent, violent years in the modern history of the United States. In the early morning hours of January 31st, South Vietnamese communists, known as the Viet Cong, launched a tremendous offensive against American and South Vietnamese troops all over South Vietnam. One Viet Cong force even penetrated the grounds of the American embassy in the capital, Saigon. This offensive was known as the Tet Offensive because it began on the first day of Tet, the Vietnamese New Year. The Viet Cong actually suffered devastating losses in the Tet Offensive, but the Americans suffered heavily too, and scenes of the fighting shown on national television shocked the American public. President Lyndon Johnson was rapidly losing support. He was already lamenting that the Vietnam War was taking a toll on his Great Society program. Then, in the first presidential primary of the 1968 campaign, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota, running on an anti-war platform, made a surprisingly strong showing against Johnson. McCarthy was not widely known, but a few days later, Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, brother of the late president, announced his candidacy on an anti-war platform. Johnson could see the handwriting on the wall. On March 31st, 1968, he made a televised address in which he announced that he had ordered a cutback in the bombing campaign against North Vietnam and had proposed peace talks with the communists. Then, at the end of his talk, he stunned the nation by announcing that he would no longer be a candidate for re-election. The spring of 1968 was tumultuous. On April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, and riots broke out in over 100 cities. Later that month, there was a violent anti-war protest at Columbia University in New York City that led to a student strike that closed down the university for the rest of the semester. Other violent demonstrations took place across the country. Then in early June, Robert Kennedy was assassinated in Los Angeles, moments after claiming victory in the California primary. His death opened the way for Vice President Hubert Humphrey to win the Democratic nomination at the party convention in Chicago. While the Democratic convention went on inside Chicago Stadium, thousands of anti-war protesters and other student radicals were battling with police outside. Violence almost broke out inside the convention as well. When Senator Abraham Ribicoff of Connecticut made a reference in his speech to the Gestapo tactics of the Chicago police, Chicago Mayor Richard Daley jumped up and began shouting obscenities at him. By contrast, the Republican convention in Miami was a calm, almost boring affair that nominated a politically reborn Richard M. Nixon for president. Alabama Governor George C. Wallace ran a strong third-party campaign as a law and order man and a hawk on Vietnam. Nixon won a narrow victory with less than 50% of the popular vote and promised to bring peace with honor in Vietnam and stability at home. However, both goals would prove to be elusive. In many ways, the real victor of the 1968 election was cynicism. Nixon was a cynical politician, and he now led an increasingly cynical nation. Most Americans seem to have lost faith in their elected officials and in government. As historian James Patterson sums up 1968, the turbulent year of 1968 was therefore a pivotal year in the post-war history of the United States. The social and cultural antagonisms that rent the country, having sharpened appreciably since 1965, widened so significantly following the shattering experiences of Tet and the assassinations of King and Kennedy that they could not thereafter be resolved. The social and political history of the United States in the next few years witnessed mainly an extension, sometimes an acceleration, of the conflicts that reached their peak in 1968. There seemed to be no turning back. As far as the war in Vietnam is concerned, the anti-war movement never really succeeded in convincing a majority of Americans that the Vietnam War was morally wrong. It did, however, succeed in convincing most Americans that the war was a bad idea. As anti-war sentiment mounted, President Richard Nixon moved to meet it by withdrawing American troops from Vietnam and turning the war over to the South Vietnamese Army. This process was known as Vietnamization. By 1972, there were only 6,000 American combat troops left in Vietnam. But in other respects, Nixon widened the war in Southeast Asia. In early May of 1970, he announced that he had ordered what he called an incursion into Cambodia to clean out major North Vietnamese sanctuaries on the other side of the South Vietnamese border. This apparent widening of the war led to the most widespread and intense college protests in American history, involving 1.5 million students and half of the nation's campuses. On May 4th, an anti-war protest turned violent and then tragic when National Guardsmen shot and killed 4 students and wounded others at Kent State University in Ohio. And a week and a half later, police killed 2 and wounded 12 at Jackson State University in Mississippi. Nixon also stepped up peace negotiations with the communists, but at the same time, he stepped up the bombing of North Vietnam. The climax of this bombing campaign came during the last 2 weeks of 1972 with Operation Linebacker II, sometimes referred to as the Christmas bombings in the media. Nixon made absolutely clear to the military his determination to inflict maximum damage on North Vietnam. He told the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, quote, "I don't want any more of this crap about the fact that we couldn't hit this target or that one. This is your chance to use military power to win this war, and if you don't, I'll consider you responsible." During the next 12 days, American B-52 bombers dropped more than 36,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong, North Vietnam's 2 largest cities. The so-called Christmas bombings did help force the North Vietnamese to return to the negotiating table in Paris, but they outraged the world. And despite what Nixon and his chief negotiator, Dr. Henry Kissinger, later claimed, the bombings did not result in a more favorable settlement for the United States. On January 27, 1973, Kissinger and chief North Vietnamese negotiator Le Duc Tho signed an agreement ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. All that had really been agreed to was that the United States would pull its fighting men out of Vietnam and that the communists would release American prisoners of war. Fighting between the communists and the South Vietnamese army broke out again almost before the ink was dry on the peace agreement and continued for 2 years. In March 1975, the communists launched a massive offensive and surprised even themselves with the ease with which they defeated the South Vietnamese. On April 30th, 1975, Americans watched what they had worked for over 2 decades to prevent as communist troops entered Saigon. The reasons for America's ultimate failure in Vietnam are still debated. Some put most of the blame on the media for distorting the truth about the war and stirring up opposition at home. Another view is that the United States never had a realistic plan for winning the war. The U.S. was basically fighting the wrong kind of war with the wrong kind of army. The Army decided to abandon the counterinsurgency approach in favor of Korea-style battles in an effort to defeat the communists in a war of attrition. Out of this emerged the search and destroy operation. The war of attrition placed a great deal of importance on the body count of enemy dead. But body counts were often inflated by local commanders in the field. Even if the body counts had not been inflated, they were not really important because at least 200,000 North Vietnamese came of draft age every year. Thus, the United States had no clear strategy other than search and destroy, which was largely ineffective, and the bombing of North Vietnam. The bombing did disrupt supply lines, but had no major effect on a non-industrial dispersed society like North Vietnam. So by trying to win an unconventional war with a conventional army and a conventional strategy, the United States never had a realistic hope of achieving victory in the traditional sense of the word. The Vietnam War divided the United States like no issue since the Civil War and left many Americans, both liberals and conservatives, profoundly disillusioned with government. The Vietnam era marked, as H.W. Brands phrases it, the triumph of cynicism. Vietnam hurt American prestige abroad, both among allies and enemies. It cost $150 billion, and of course, some 58,000 Americans lost their lives in Vietnam, and another 270,000 were wounded, not to mention the psychological wounds suffered by many soldiers. The dominoes fell in Southeast Asia, as not only South Vietnam, but also Cambodia and Laos fell under communist control. The communist regime in Cambodia was especially brutal as it turned the country into a vast killing field that exterminated almost a third of the population.